So today we are talking to Seyed Mohammad Marandi. He is a professor of English and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. He was an advisor for the JCPOA Iran negotiating team, which was the nuclear deal for those who don't recognize that acronym. And at the age of 16, he joined as a volunteer fighter against the US-backed invasion of Iran. He's a highly sought after expert on Iran. Recently, he made a fool of Piers Morgan, so some of you may recognize him. And Dr. Marandi, I think you did a absolutely fantastic job on Piers Morgan. So welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I want to get right into it. We hear a lot about revolutions, the Russian Revolution, the Nicaraguan Revolution, the American Revolution, but we never really hear a lot of details about the Iranian Revolution and the benefits that it brought to its people. So I was hoping you could go into a little of the basics and maybe some details regarding the Iranian Revolution.
I think one reason why people know very little about it is because there's always been a great deal of hostility directed towards the revolution itself. During the Cold War, there were two dominant powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And a revolution taking place in a non-European or non-Eastern or Western Bloc context was something that was, I think, deemed as impossible. A real revolution with indigenous values and ideas put forward. And I think it was perceived in the West and in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc that anything that comes out from Iran would probably or definitely be backward, reactionary. And the narrative that came, that was produced about Iran in both the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc was very negative for obvious reasons. Neither had an interest in the revolutionary ideas in Iran. Neither wanted the revolutionary ideas to spread. They were
so you had mentioned the indigenous foundation of the Iranian Revolution, and in the West we hear a lot about indigenous rights and how, you know, promoting and upholding indigenous rights are really important, but many of the times, not all the time, indigenous rights are advocated for by people who denounce Iran. And whether it's because of their own ignorance or because simply they don't realize that Iran is essentially the foremost indigenous power in the world, it doesn't really have an impact on the dialogue. So could you highlight a little more about the indigenous aspect of the Iranian Revolution?
Sure. I just want to add that also after the revolution, there was a coalition, let's say, where regional countries that were linked to the United States, client regimes, they also demonized Iran because they were afraid of the revolution spreading. And therefore, countries like Saudi Arabia, they began to promote Wahhabism and Takfiri ideology to prevent the spread of the revolution. They wanted to create hostility towards Iran, towards the Shia in particular, among Sunnis in the region and beyond, in order to preserve their kingdom, in order to preserve the kingdoms in the Persian Gulf and also other family dictatorships in the region. And this coincided with the interests of the United States and also the Soviet bloc. So while the Soviet Union was and the Eastern Bloc was attacking Iran, and while the Western Bloc was also attacking Iran and accusing it of all sorts of atrocities and how people were being executed, so they claimed, people were being executed day and night, and Iran was a dystopia, and it continues to be uh, presented as a dystopia until today, for over 4 decades. But alongside that came this very extremist ideology that, as I said, the source of it for the most part came from Saudi Arabia. And that was aligned to the West. So on the one hand, the West was attacking Iran for its religious revolution. But on the other hand, it was actually promoting an extremist ideology that had all of those characteristics that they were falsely attributing to Iran. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. So all of those evil characteristics that the Americans were constantly and continue to constantly attribute to Iran, those, or at least many of those characteristics, were actually a part of this extremist ideology that was being promoted by the Saudis, among others. It wasn't just, it was takfiri. It basically was extremely intolerant. And also it prevented women from being able to have jobs or go to proper schools or to university. It also, they would execute large numbers of people. But these were allies of the United States. So they were not really, US allies were not attacked for promoting this ideology because, as I said, it was all directed towards American opponents. Whether, for example, in the case of Saudi Arabia, they promoted this ideology alongside Afghanistan and Pakistan in order to fight the Soviet Union. And even the textbooks of these groups, of these extremist groups back then, were printed in the United States. I think it was the University of Nebraska. Until later on, the Saudis began to print and publish these books themselves. So it was used for the Soviet Union, but also later on used to, as I said, to contain Iran or the Islamic Revolution. So, and it is from that we had the extremist groups that that later on prevented girls from going to school. The same Al-Qaeda that on 9/11, we were told that they carried out the attacks on the Twin Towers. And of course, it was that same Al-Qaeda that we were told carried out the attacks on the Twin Towers that a decade later, just literally a decade later, the Americans and their European allies were using to overthrow the government in Libya and also to overthrow the government in Syria. So on February the 12th, 2012, Jake Sullivan sent a letter to Hillary Clinton saying, in Syria, Al-Qaeda is on our side. But also you had a person, if you recall, in Manchester who carried out a suicide attack, killing a large number of people at a concert, I think. He was fighting in Libya along with his father. Both of them were connected to British intelligence. So these extremist groups, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and others that we see across the region, their ideologies were coming from Saudi Arabia. Yet it was Iran that was being demonized. So you had this coalition that was constantly demonizing Iran, and that's why anything that Iran does is looked upon suspiciously by many people, because the propaganda is very extensive, and it's been going on for decades. So after the revolution, one of the a number of the, let's say, a number of the key elements of the revolution, although we don't have time to go over too many things, but one of them is social justice. And we saw that, for example, an extensive healthcare network was developed across the country after the revolution, something that we also see in Cuba. We also see in Cuba a very extensive healthcare network there. Universal
We see
education.
it in Nicaragua as well. Since the revolution, they've developed
That's
a
right.
free public healthcare system, which is where I'm based.
That's right. Also, uh, in Iran, universal education uh, what became law, and I think during the revolution, more than half of Iranians, and especially girls, were not going to school or were illiterate, and now almost every child goes to school, including uh, Afghan children who are here as refugees, but also Afghans whose children who are here illegally, their children also go to schools, despite the fact that the country is facing all these sanctions. So remember, this is
Wow.
the country is facing a huge burden today, but it continues to give I mean, it's not an utopia. I'm not saying in it that Iran is in any by any means a utopia, but what I'm saying is it's definitely not the dystopia that they like to tell everyone in Western media or the media of these Arab dictatorships. So one is social justice, and as I said, universal um, uh, education. But also, for example, right now in all cities in Iran, we have gas, natural gas in all the cities, as far as I know, and in many villages. So gasoline is heavily subsidized. So gasoline in Iran is roughly 2.5 cents a liter.
Wow.
Yeah, that's I think unique that we live in. So even though sometimes you'll hear in the Western media that like wages in Iran are very low and life is and they may give they may give like numbers that are much lower than the West, but you have to take into account the fact that their gasoline is very heavily subsidized, electricity is subsidized, water is subsidized, even water, although um, perhaps that shouldn't be subsidized, but um, um, and and um, and natural gas, electricity, as I said, these are all subsidized. Now, many argue that these subsidies are not really the right thing to do, and that those subsidies should be removed, and that the wealth should be distributed in a different way. That's an ongoing debate. But the
But
point,
it is wealth distribution. I mean, we have the same sort of things here where under a certain amount of electricity consumption in Nicaragua, the government subsidizes it. They subsidize the gasoline as well. And people say Nicaragua is socialist. So in some ways, these sound sort of like socialist policies that you're talking about.
well, here I wouldn't say it's socialist, but I would say it's social justice. But again, there is an ongoing debate in Iran because many say that these low prices benefit the rich more than anyone else. They on weekends they go on long trips to the north of Iran, which is all forests, and there's a seaside, and so people they travel along, regularly with their cars at the expense of and because of the subsidies, they are benefiting from those subsidies, whereas the poor won't travel as much. So that sort of argument exists. But the point that I'm making is that whether the policies are necessarily good or they should be reformed or revised, the point is that there's a strong social justice element in the policies that the government pursues. Now, we've had different administrations with different views on social justice. Some were more liberal, like the previous administration. This one is more, the current administration is more focused on social justice. I don't mean to say that this administration is more competent or the previous one was, but I personally think that uh, both administrations, this one, the previous, and the ones before them, all have their own shortcomings. But in any case, the general view, let's say the predominant ideological view is one that stresses social justice. So, and I'd also like to add that it's often said that in Iran, women are abused and they have no rights. I've said this before. After the revolution, there was universal education for all girls. And there's only one small part of the country near the Pakistani border where, because of a certain trend, a certain, let's say, segment of the Iranian population that is influenced by Taliban and their ideology, they constantly, and they're a small segment of the population, but they pull their girls out of school, and it's a problem with the government. But
Wow, I didn't know that. That's very
but
interesting.
yeah, but across the country, um, girls they normally finish high school. Most university students are female. Most of my students are female. The dean of my faculty is a woman. Over the last 20 years, 20 almost 20
Wow.
20 years, 17 of those 20 and a half years, the dean of my faculty was a woman. The last person who we've hired in my department, she's a woman. And then I'm an affiliate in another department in another department at the University of Tehran, in another faculty. The last two academics who were hired there were both women. So the way in which Iran is depicted in the West, as I said, due to political reasons, and also because of a disrespect, basically, for any ideology that does not come from Europe or from the West. It's looked down upon. Somehow it must be somehow inferior. So therefore, it's not taken seriously because of these reasons. Many people usually don't know this. Again, I'm not saying that the situation for women in Iran is ideal. The situation in general in Iran is not ideal. But I think when you take into account the fact that this is the most heavily sanctioned country in the world, the Russians now say that they're more sanctioned, but I think Iran is still more sanctioned because none of the Iranian banks can carry out transactions abroad. But I think the Russians have a bit more there's a bit more flexibility with the Russians so
Yeah,
far.
it seems like their economy is so large that they're able to get around some of the sanctions that, while Iran has also done the same, Iran may be struggling to get around some of those
Well, the
similar
Russians
sanctions.
also, because of the sheer amount of oil that they export, the West is trying to they can't enforce sanctions on Russia like they can on Iran because
Right.
it cause a crisis with an energy crisis, especially.
Sure.
Iran has already been sanctioned. Venezuela has already been sanctioned, so the market is tight enough as it is. But in any case, Iran is heavily sanctioned, and
Mm.
despite all that, and the 8 years of war that we had, where Saddam Hussein invaded the country at the behest of the West, or at least with their support, and the support of the Soviet Union, Iran, I think, it has done pretty well. It's under siege. The Americans are constantly trying to undermine the country. So, it has many shortcomings. If you sit in a taxi in Iran, people will grumble. If you sit in the metro, people will grumble. If you sit in a bus, people will grumble. Uh,
Yeah, I
and that,
think it's the same like that in any country in the world. I mean, from the United States to Nicaragua, Russia, every country has that. I mean,
yeah, but
nothing
I
is a
think in the
utopia,
West, the
right?
perception is that in Iran, people can't talk.
Right.
Whereas the places where people cannot talk are actually those places which are allied to the United States, like Saudi
Right.
Arabia, Emirates,
Or
like,
even Germany, where RT is banned from the airwaves.
yeah, well, also all of Iranian media is banned in the West. Everything.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
It will expand everywhere because the West has imposed sanctions globally. But
Right, especially on Press TV. I mean, Press
the,
TV used to have a decent presence among anti-war folks in the United States, and while they still do, the sanctions have taken a toll. I remember before Elon Musk came, it was labeled as Iranian state media. That's not the case anymore, but the point still
I think they've
stands.
also removed their blue check or whatever.
Their
Just
gold check, yeah, which
yeah,
costs like $1,000 a month. So Elon, I guess, didn't want that money, or someone pressured him. Maybe someone whispered in his ear while he was visiting Auschwitz. Um, that
and
seems to be what has happened.
also many people have lost their accounts. I've
Yeah,
my Facebook account was deleted. My Instagram account was deleted. Uh,
yeah.
Twitter
When
account
actually it
was
was about 4 years ago, I shared a photo of maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I shared a photo of aerial view of Qassam Soleimani's funeral, which had, as I'm sure you know, well over 1 million attendees. And as a result of sharing that photo, my personal Facebook account has been suppressed for like 3 or 4 years. It's been a while, but it's still going.
yeah. So again, I stress that sometimes people, Western journalists, tell me that why don't you criticize Iran in the media? And I always tell them, well, if you give me a daily show, 30 minutes, I'll criticize Iran for 10 minutes, but I'll use the other 20 minutes to explain how Iran isn't what you say it is.